Next to a great forest, there lived a poor woodcutter who had come upon such hard times that he could scarcely provide daily bread for his wife and his 2 children, Hansel and Gretel. Hi everyone, my name is Sarah-Jayne.
And my name is T.
And we're Crumbs of Science, a podcast about the science in and around fairy tales. Now, because this is our very first episode, we thought we'd give you a little bit of a background about ourselves. So my name's Sarah-Jayne, or SJ, and I think that I decided at about 5 years old that I was going to be a fairy princess in my future. To the extremes where my 21st birthday, it was themed, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I went as a fairy princess. But I also have a science background. I have an undergraduate degree in chemical engineering and arts from the University of Western Australia. And after I graduated, I spent 5 years travelling around the world working on oil rigs on 6 continents so far. So almost made it to all the continents of the world. 1 more to go.
Is that one more Antarctica?
It is Antarctica. It's very hard to get to, but I have experienced at least a little bit of all the others so far. So I've also done a fair bit of science, and now I've left that job and I'm currently studying a Masters of Science Communication Outreach at the Australian National University, which is why we're doing this podcast.
And so my name's T, and I'm also studying the Masters of Science Communication Outreach at Australian National University. And I'd just like to thank the Australian National University for the use of their facilities in recording this podcast today. I studied journalism and geology at university, and I actually worked for several years putting on science kids parties, where I'd go to children's birthday parties, and instead of a clown, I would be a scientist, and everyone would get to do science experiments. I've also done a bit.
What was your favourite? Your favourite science experiment that you did at a kid's birthday party?
So one of my favourites was definitely making little rockets. We mix Alka-Seltzer and water in little pointy test tubes, and then put them on a little base, and you just put it on the ground and count down 5, 4, and then it just goes off. Great experiment. Definitely need safety glasses for everyone though. Those things move very fast. But I also did a bunch of science as well. During my geology degree, I did a 3-week field trip out to Broken Hill, out to the desert where they filmed Mad Max, and got to camp for 3 weeks and stare at the ground. It was great.
I think that's most of geology, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really tough to make sound exciting.
Is geology a real science? Oh, who knows? So our podcast is about fairy tales, and this week, if you couldn't tell from that opener, we're discussing Hansel and Gretel, which is one of the most famous fairy tales originally published in 1812 by the Brothers Grimm. And a fun little fact, this story was told to them by Dorchen Wilde, who later on actually married one of the brothers. She married Wilhelm. So the story of Hansel and Gretel it's a fairly tragic start to it. 2 children and their 2 parents who are living in their lovely little cottage near the woods. And one evening, the father suddenly comes to the realization that we have no food. So his wife turns over to him and says, "Listen, man, early tomorrow, take the 2 children, give each of them a little piece of bread, then lead them into the middle of the thickest part of the woods. Make a fire for them and leave them there, for we can no longer feed them." The man protests a little bit, says that he can't do this. He loves his children. But then the woman says, "If you don't do it, all of us will starve together." And she gave him no peace until he said yes. Little interesting thing about this, you would have heard there that I've said that it's his wife or the mother, which is how the original version in 1812 went. But the version in 1857 actually had it as the stepmother. So the Brothers Grimm realised that they could make this story more exciting, then included it as a stepmother instead, and then that was part of the whole stepmother trope, which you'll also see in Cinderella and Snow White. And pretty much, if you've got a stepmother, they're going to try and kill you, I think is how these stories go.
After their father has been convinced to take them in the woods by his wife, the children hear everything that the father has said, and Hansel tells Gretel that he has a plan. He's going to get them back. And so he goes outside, he fills his pockets with pebbles, and then he goes back in the house and goes back to sleep. In the morning, the mother comes and wakes up and says, "Get up, children, we're going into the woods. Here's some bread. Don't eat it till midday." The father leads them out into the woods and starts a fire for them and says, "Just go take a nap, and I'll go back and cut down some trees, and I'll be right back." And of course, he doesn't come back. But because the kids already know about the plan, Hansel has been dropping pebbles through on the journey there. And so when the moon comes up, he can see his way back. So he follows the pebbles all the way back to their house.
Family was all happy again. Everyone was nice and cheerful. Until about a month later when they realised, we still have no food. This story is actually there are a bunch of stories about children being abandoned. There's the French one, which was Le Petit Poucet. There's Finette Cendron, which was the story of 3 princesses abandoned by their parents. And there's another version in Italy by Giambattista Basile, where the cruel stepmother kicks the kids out. And this actually has some origins in a human event, which happened in 1315 to 1317 or 1325, depending on what you look at, which was the Great Famine. Now, the Great Famine was due to some horrible weather conditions in Northern Europe, specifically affecting the English Isles, France, and those sort of areas around there, and all their crops died, and the situation got worse and worse until 1318 when they finally had some good weather again. But through those 3 years, times were really, really tough, and it's been said that between 10% and 25% of the villagers in those countries actually died, pretty much due to starvation, or if they didn't die due to starvation, they were so weak that then the diseases came and picked them off really quickly. And during this time, people went to some really extreme measures to try and get enough food to feed their family. And these measures included murder, robbing your friends and neighbours, the old voluntarily not eating so that they would die, cannibalism, and also abandoning your children in the woods to fend for themselves. So this horrible fairy tale probably actually happened. Maybe not the rest of it, but the origins are based on actual life events. So the mother, once again, convinced the father, we need to get rid of these children, or we're all going to starve. And Hansel and Gretel, once again, because they had no food, they were awake at night, very hungry. And Hansel thought again, that's all right, I'll go down, get some pebbles, I'm a smart cookie, I've got this. But it turns out that the mother had actually locked the door, so they couldn't get out. Now, they were given 2 slices of bread to carry in their pockets for the walk because these parents weren't totally heartless. So this time, Hansel crumbled up the bread and left it behind on the walk. They once again got to the woods, the parents tried the same trick. You stay here, rest by the fire. We're just going to go chop down some more firewood. And once again, the parents disappeared. Hansel waited till that evening, until the moon would rise and he could see his trail of breadcrumbs. But then, turns out, they were all gone. Animals ate them. I don't know how this could have happened. Animals eating breadcrumbs. But Hansel, though he was a bit of a thinker, didn't think that hard.
So quite regularly you'll see articles going around saying, oh no, you shouldn't feed birds bread. Oh, you can't be feeding the ducks bread. You'll kill the ducks.
It's like the very famous scene in About a Boy when he's feeding bread to the ducks and then he throws the whole loaf and then the duck dies.
You can actually you can feed bread to birds. It's totally fine to feed bread to birds, just like it's totally fine for humans to eat bread. But here's the thing, you shouldn't eat it all the time.
But Oprah loves bread. She would eat it all the time if she could.
So would I. But it's not healthy for us, and it's not healthy for the birds either. It's a lot of empty proteins. It fills the bird up without actually providing any nutritional value. The Royal Society for Protection of Birds in the UK advises that you should only feed small amounts of bread and try to mix up the type of things you feed. So you're not just feeding them bread. Whole grain bread, much better for birds as opposed to white bread, partially because the whole grain bread has all those little seeds and grains and other things that are nutritional by themselves contained within the bread, whereas white bread is just purely the bread itself and is not very good for the birds. There's an article in the Washington Post about different types of bird seeds and how many bird seeds are actually filled with the type of seed that birds don't eat. So there's a type of seed called Milo, which comes from a particular plant. While it's really good agricultural feeding, so feeding various fowl like chickens and so on, it's not so good for backyard birds. Backyard birds will just leave it in the container. He says that on a theoretical scale from 0, where no bird has any preference to it, and 30, where every species eats this type of seed, red Milo seed, that makes up the majority of birdseed, rates a 6, which is the lowest score of any seed type. At the top of the list, the things that birds love to eat, is sunflower seeds, black oil sunflower seed, or shelled sunflower. Apparently the sunflower seeds that humans like to eat are not the kind that birds like.
Oh, well, that's good, because I don't like sharing my food. So the story continues. They couldn't find their way home, so instead they wandered around the wood all through the night, the entire next day. They were horribly hungry because they'd only managed to find a few small berries to eat. Then on the third day, they walked until midday when they came to a little house built entirely from bread with a roof made of cake, and the windows were made of clear sugar. Now, to any child, or any person really, this sounds like a dream. But to two little children who'd been wandering for 3 days with nothing to eat, probably thought that it was a mirage. But by that point, they're willing to eat anything, even mirage stuff. So they sat down and they started eating this house. Whenever I think of this story, I always think of it as a gingerbread house, though it doesn't actually say that in the narration of the original 1812 or 1857 version. And as an engineer, I'm not quite sure how great bread or gingerbread would be as a house.
Cool. So there are actually competitive gingerbread house making competitions, and one of the largest houses, gingerbread houses ever built, had an actual internal volume of 1,000 square meters, built as a charity fundraiser in 2013.
Can you think 1,000 square meters? That's a bit hard to visualize.
Yeah.
What sort of
So it's nearly 20.
size?
It's nearly 20 meters long and 12 meters wide, and it was 6 meters tall at its highest point. So it's about the size of a small actual house.
That would require so many step ladders to build. So we called structural engineer Will Horton, currently working at GHD, to ask him some questions about gingerbread houses, which is a very normal thing to do in your workday. So, Will, tell us a bit about gingerbread houses. Would you build with gingerbread, and why?
In the construction of something like this, you tend to need to look at it in two ways. There's the materials you use for the construction and also the applied loads. So in those two avenues, I mean, the capacity of gingerbread as a construction material, I mean, there has been some research done to date, obviously not on this scale, but in essence, it does appear to behave quite similarly to concrete in that, well, I would say unreinforced concrete in that it is quite brittle in nature. So if you do load it, if you do stand on, say, a floor panel made from gingerbread, it would likely just crumble underneath your feet. When I say brittle, it's more, it has no tensile capacity. So if you try and pull it apart, it's very weak. If you try and compress it, it would have some strength, but it would probably crumble. So as a construction material, you would really need to either limit the load to ensure it was within capacity, or you would need to somehow strengthen it. And there are various ways you could do that. You could use some sort of taffy or marshmallow to really reinforce it and give it more tensile strength, so that if it was to be loaded and if it was to deform, the marshmallow, the taffy, would act as a cement and hold it together and give it that additional strength.
So Will, with gingerbread as building material, how big of a house could you make?
It comes down to, in one sense, the location of the building. So I see there would be no actual constraints on how high or how wide it could go. You can always engineer the materials to take it, because as you go higher with these buildings, it's exposed to more wind loading. That's, I imagine, something you can't really design out. So if you imagine a building with 4 walls, obviously you have a windward face. I think what probably helped in this case, given my understanding is the site would be in a forest of some sort. Typically, you would get some shielding from any wind loads by the trees or by any brooks or whatever that was nearby. So that might be working in our favour, and you could then go higher. with these kind of structures, especially with a brittle material like gingerbread, you can actually strengthen it by having a compression load acting on it. So in this sense here, with your walls, they're obviously supporting the roof. The roof is exerting a dead load, its own self-weight on those walls. That load is compressing these walls and would strengthen them under any lateral forces like wind or whatnot. I don't know if this would be a two-story house. I think with a gingerbread cottage, you might want to keep it single story, and that would definitely make construction easier. It comes down to what she needs. Does she really need like a 4-bedroom house, or is she fine with a 2-bedroom? Might be fine to go single story.
Now, we know that it's a little bit hard to work out 14th century prices, and also magic, of course, is priceless. But can you maybe give us a bit of an estimate of how much this gingerbread house would cost to build?
Typically, with a construction like this, there's several different avenues where the cost comes from. You obviously have the design itself, which is a proportion of the fee, and the documentation thereof to assist in the construction. There is the procurement of the materials, procurement of the resources, so the manual labour required, any plants or whatnot that you might need to help you pour the gingerbread. In terms of the manual labour, I'm sure there is a portion of magic that can be involved to assist with any lifting. So for any heavier precast elements, if they were to be used, why would you hire a crane when you can use the witch's magical powers? I don't know. But I imagine there's not that many of them, and they would be a specialised resource. Perhaps it would be quite expensive. If it's a very remote site, it might be that the highest cost comes from transportation. So gingerbread, luckily enough, would be quite light to transport. I'm not sure if they would be baking it on site, or if they're baking it in, say, a workshop nearby and then transporting it to site. So there's a few variables to really look at before we give a final cost to this.
Thanks so much, Will. We really appreciate you coming along and lending your expertise to our podcast.
Thanks, guys.
So we left off in the story before we got very distracted by amazing gingerbread houses that Hansel and Gretel had just started eating this house of bread when they heard, "Nibble, nibble, little mouse, who is nibbling at my house?" Hansel and Gretel were obviously terrified, but then out of the doors walked a lovely little old woman. And she took pity on these children and said, "Oh, you dear children, where did you come from? Come inside with me and you will be just fine." So she took them in, she gave them some nice food. They then went to bed thinking, "Oh, yay, we're so lucky." But the twist is that this old woman was a wicked witch who was lying in wait there for children. So she had built her house of bread in order to lure them to her, and if she captured one, she would kill him, cook him, and eat him. And for her, that was a day to celebrate. Pretty horrific celebration. But still, once again, no judgment. 1300s. Life was tough.
Yeah, get what you can.
When this story originated from in the 1300s, witches weren't seen in the same way as we view them in the 15 or 1600s, or they were viewed now. So in the 10th century, there was a canon or a book of sorts called Episcopi, which talked about women being seduced by illusions from the devil. And then they would think that they could fly on the backs of certain beasts in the middle of the night alongside the goddess Diana. However, these women were dismissed as being stupid and foolish, thinking, how on earth could they do that? How silly women, goodness. Then it was only in the 15 and the 1600s that inquisitors started to believe that women could actually make magic happen by pacts with the devil. And they were pretty terrified of these women because they thought that they could do things like putting a broomstick in water and then causing a storm or a flood. So then you had all the horrible witch hunts of the 15 and 1600s. Where, how was it that they told if people were witches?
So one of the most famous tests is to chain someone up and throw them in a river, because if they floated, they're a witch and should be killed. But if they drowned and died, well, good news, not for them, they weren't a witch.
Foolproof method, really.
I mean, it's just science.
Simple science. That's obviously the best method to tell if people were witches. So Hansel and Gretel, they were sleeping very peacefully. The witch looked at them and said, "They will be a good mouthful." So she grabbed Hansel, threw him in a little stall, and then she made Gretel cook for him for the next few days. so cooking him delicious things in order to fatten him up so that she could eat him when he was fat and delicious, not skinny and tough. So, and all Gretel got to eat during this time was crayfish shells. So poor little Gretel, she's not doing great. Then again, Hansel's about to get eaten, so he's not doing great either.
No one really comes out on top on the story.
No, they're pretty upsetting. So every day, the witch would test Hansel to see if he was fat enough to be delicious food. So she would get him to stick his finger through the bar because she didn't have very good eyesight. Hansel was actually able to trick her by instead sticking a stick out. So every day, it didn't seem like he was getting any fatter despite all the deliciousness that he was eating. However, after 4 weeks, the witch got fed up and said to Gretel, "Hurry up and fetch some water. Whether your brother is fat enough now or not, tomorrow I am going to slaughter him and boil him. In the meantime, I want to start the dough that we will bake to go with him." So Gretel was pretty sad. In the 1812 version of the story, it actually says that she stood in the kitchen and cried tears of blood, which once again, horrific, which honestly, that could probably happen in the 13th century. People were not healthy.
The Brothers Grimm clearly thought that was a little bit much, though, because in their 1857 version, they've now edited it out, and it's not in the traditional retelling of the story.
Not saying that Gretel cried tears of blood, but that would look so pretty in the animations. No. So the witch called Gretel over, and the witch said to her, "Look inside and see if the bread is nicely brown and done, for my eyes are weak and I can't see that far. If you can't see that far either, then sit on the board and I'll push you inside. Then you can walk around inside and take a look." So she can walk around inside. Pretty big oven. But Gretel was a little bit clever, and she realised that the witch probably didn't have very good intentions if she was going to shut her inside an oven. So instead, Gretel said, "I don't know how to do that. First, show me. You sit on the board and I will push you inside." And the old woman sat on the board, and since she was light, Gretel pushed her all the way inside and then quickly closed the door and secured it with an iron bar. The old woman in the hot oven began to cry and to wail, but Gretel ran away, and the old woman burned up miserably.
We decided to see if the witch's plan was going to work in the first place. Even if it hadn't been foiled by these clever children, could she have actually cooked and eaten them in this oven?
So we did some calculations of our own. Neither of us are experts in cooking children. We decided that we would call on an expert. So we called Dr Jake Barlow, who is currently working at the pediatric ward at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne. So, Jake, as a doctor, you're very wise, know lots of things. Could you tell us, could this witch survive just on a diet of children?
It probably would be reasonably nutritious. It's, decent quality red meat. I think the main concern from a medical point of view would be developing a disease known as Kuru, which is a form of prion disease. So prion diseases are quite cool. So the way they work is essentially you have a protein that is folded, so it's assembled badly, and in such a way that it will both cause other proteins to fold badly, and therefore it sort of spreads itself. Mad cow disease would be the classic. The protein causes a degeneration of the brain, sort of like a dementia type process, and then that would lead to progressive, loss of cognitive function and then death. The problem with this is because these proteins, when they fold in this way, they're also very resistant to heat. So they might need to be heated to like 3,500 degrees Celsius or something similarly difficult to achieve in your standard kitchen oven, especially in your gingerbread house, which would probably burn down at temperatures much below 3,500 degrees Celsius. And so these proteins survive the cooking process, and then when you eat them, they start doing their folding problem in you. And so they're transmissible, but they're not sort of alive in the same way that something like a bacterial infection is transmissible and alive.
So, Jake, if you were going to roast a child, how would you do it?
I haven't considered this before. I think you could think of a number of options, and I think it would probably depend on the child. I mean, my concern would be the surface area to volume ratio of the child. Obviously, children are small, so they have a relatively high surface area compared to their volume, which means that they gain and lose heat quickly, which is relevant from a medical point of view, but I would imagine also be relevant from a cooking point of view, because you wouldn't want to have your child cooked on or burnt on the outside and still cold on the inside. So you'd want to make sure that they cooked through evenly. Therefore, I'm thinking your options would either be to sort of slow roast the child to ensure that especially a larger child, to ensure that the core is cooked through, or potentially something like a spit roast, like you would do with an entire whole pig or something like that.
So, Jake, these children have been wandering for 3 days in the woods. What sort of state would they be in by the time they made it to the witch's cottage?
I think there are a lot of issues at play here. Obviously, you need to think about the environment that they're in, so exposure will be a factor. The quality of their clothing, if it's sort of threadbare, homespun potato sack, that will provide minimal insulation, and so the child will develop hypothermia more rapidly, as we discussed sort of previously with the surface area to volume ratio element. Weather will obviously affect that, especially if it's raining and then their clothing becomes sodden. The environment they're in, wind chill, protection from other elements, their either availability of fuel or ability to light a fire to conserve heat and provide warmth. The bread will provide a degree of sustenance, but obviously it's only mostly carbohydrate and doesn't really have much in the way of vitamins or minerals or other micronutrients. 3 days, certainly possible for children who are acclimatized to the environment, but it would very much depend on the weather.
Well, that's a lot of information I didn't know and probably shouldn't know. Thanks, Jake, for coming on the show. So the story continues. The witch having burned up, Gretel runs to Hansel and unlocks his door. He jumps out. They're very excited to not be killed and eaten, as he would be. And then they look around and find that the whole house is actually filled with precious stones and pearls.
This is an amazing house.
And these children are really just not very observant. They walk into a house, they don't see the cage, they don't see the
human-sized oven.
Yeah, and they don't see all of the gems. But anyway, they find these precious stones and pearls, they fill their pockets with all of them, and they find their way back home. Their father rejoiced when he saw them once more, for he had not had a happy day since they had been gone, and now he was a rich man. However, the mother had died. Now, when I was reading that, I thought, okay, what happens after that? But no, that's how the story ends, is, however, the mother had died.
Such a great last sentence of a children's fairy tale that, let's be honest, probably your mum is reading out to you. So this story might not seem like it has a whole lot to do with science, but there's a pretty cool mix between magic and science that was around in those sorts of days, because they had a bit of a weird definition of magic, and let's be honest, a weird definition of science. So William of Auvergne, who was a 13th century French priest and bishop, so just before the time of the Great Famine, he believed that magic was superstition. However, natural magic was a part of science, and if you didn't use it for evil, this was fine. And some elements of natural magic, whether seal skin could be used as a charm to repel lightning, vulture body parts were obviously a protective amulet, and if you wanted your garden to grow well, you would get virgins to plant your seeds, because that was a scientific way of promoting their growth. So probably not quite how we define science today, but they also had some other weird things going on with the science and the medicine of the time, because they believed in sympathetic magic, which was using imitation to produce effective results. So, for example, if a patient was suffering from a liver complaint, they would use the liver of a vulture to cure it.
So an example of this is using a treatment to help stop the flow of blood from a wound by using wool soaked in olive oil from the Mount of Olives, and combining that with a spoken story about Longinus, who was famously healed of his blindness using the blood of Christ. So these were religious elements blended with the magical and with the scientific.
It's a little bit cagey on what you'd call science, but then again, science wasn't all that advanced at the time. They had some famous scientists around that era, such as Fibonacci, who you've probably heard of, with the very famous Fibonacci sequence named after him, who was actually an accountant. and was famous for introducing Arabic numerals to Europe and making accountants' lives easier. And also a very famous scientist at the time was Roger Bacon, who is called by some as the first modern scientist. And he wrote on all areas of science and even managed to envision machines for travelling on land or water, submarines and air travel, which is pretty advanced when you think that they were mainly going around by a horse and buggy. Now that we've spent so long learning about Hansel and Gretel, maybe you can answer a question for me. How did Hansel and Gretel get lost in the woods?
I don't know, SJ. How did Hansel and Gretel get lost in the woods?
The trail was crummy. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. Hopefully you'll tune in next week when we're going to talk about The Little Mermaid by Hans Christian Andersen, one of my all-time favourites.
So until then, we hope you have a happily ever after.